Hello and welcome to Fossil Arcade. Previously I've done a video on the Astro City arcade stick which was released for the Astro City Mini, and it only worked with the Astro City Mini. So in my previous review I mostly talked about modding the stick so that it could work with all modern consoles and other mini consoles. That means I could now use the stick on PlayStation, Nintendo, Xbox and all the other mini consoles I own. It even works on the Taito Egret 2 Mini. However, even though its compatibility has been greatly expanded, there's still some functionality it doesn't have. In that previous modding video, you'll see I've noted down that there are 3 buttons which the stick still doesn't really allow you to use. That's the home button and 2 shoulder buttons. That's because the Astro City stick is a 6-button controller with just 2 extra buttons for start and select. It doesn't make any difference on the mini consoles, and of course you can still use the controller to play any game you want to play, but you're really missing that home button on the modern systems, especially Xbox and PlayStation, where connecting the controller becomes a bit more complicated. You could reassign some of the buttons so you have home on the controller somewhere else, but then you'd inevitably lose one of the other buttons. If you take away the credit button and make it home, you then don't have the credit button when you want to use the Astro City Mini. So to kind of complete the mod and give the stick its maximum compatibility with all consoles, I need to cut 3 holes in the stick so that I can add those 3 missing buttons, and that's exactly what I've done. When I first modded the stick, I was very happy for it to become compatible with all of my consoles, but I knew that that missing home button especially was going to be an issue, and over the past year while I've been playing with the stick, I need to have an additional controller near me so I can get back to the home menu or do other things that this controller can't do. And I want to eliminate that frustration and add 3 new buttons in the cleanest and most authentic way I can, so that when somebody picks up this stick, they wouldn't know those 3 buttons hadn't been there from its original manufacturing. I spoke to some other arcade stick enthusiasts, including Hype36RMax, whose notes I had followed for the previous mod, and people told me that if you do this too quickly, you could risk cracking the shell of the arcade stick, and it would be very hard to replace the Astro City arcade stick if I messed it up, so I really needed to be methodical and make sure that everything was done correctly. So what is the step-by-step process of creating this mod? Well, you're going to need to cut some holes and maybe extend some wires, so you're going to need a cutting tool. I've got a Bosch power drill in my home that I use for DIY, and I've purchased the Bosch circular 24mm cutting bit in order to cut the holes. 24mm is the size of the button I'm going to put in, so that's the size of the hole I need to cut. I also have a wire crimping tool, which I'll go over in a moment, and I have a Dremel, which I've used to cut away plastic on the inside. First thing you need to do is to decide where on the controller you'd like those extra buttons to be. I've spoken to some people who've done this, and some have added them to this side of the stick where they are very visible and easily accessible over the top, but I opted to add them to the right hand side where they are kind of covered by this little ledge, and you can reach them easily just over the side there. Additionally, cutting the holes here to me makes the cut a lot more easy. You're cutting them face on a flat surface rather than going at a kind of perpendicular angle here on the angled side. To me, this would add an element of risk that I'm not comfortable with. I also like the idea that you can't see the buttons a lot of the time, which kind of meant that if I did cut buttons along this side and I messed it up and created some ugly mess, I could perhaps still look at the stick from the top down and pretend that that hadn't ever happened. And regardless of where you cut the holes for these buttons, there's still going to be extra plastic in here that needs cutting away from the inside. Whether you do it at the top, the bottom, or either of the sides, you're going to have to cut away not just the outside, but some of the inside too. There is like a little square here on the Astro City stick, which some people have taken as an indicator that this should be where you put an extra button for home. But to me, this is the natural location. And this little square of plastic, I don't think it really means anything. I just think there's a square there. I'd love to know what this is all about. This square is a mystery to me. So having chosen where the buttons are going to live, you then need to check that the quick connect wires inside the stick can actually reach that position. And this is what I found, that actually where I want the buttons to be, the wires are not long enough to get there. So to fix that problem, you need to extend the quick connects. I did this by just going and purchasing some loose quick connect cables that can be used to replace damaged cables within arcade sticks. And using a wire stripper and a crimper, I have extended those cables. The crimping method of extending wires is basically done by placing a plastic sleeve over two ends of exposed wire, and inside that plastic sleeve is a metal tube. You then crush the plastic down onto the two wires, which sandwiches that metal connection inside so that there is a conductive element in there, and then you can lengthen the wire. I bought an all-in-one stripper and crimping tool, and it's a very easy and satisfying process, and I tested the buttons worked on those extended wires before I did any cutting. So the next step is to carefully and precisely measure where those actual holes are going to be cut. I didn't want to cut anything in the wrong place, and I was quite ambitious in wanting the stick to look like these buttons had always been there. I decided to try and line up the home button the best I could with the start and credit buttons on the top side, and keep the shoulder buttons lower down so that they would sort of be where the playing area is on the top. As you can see, I chose to go with the smaller 24mm sandwire buttons, which also helps to match those sort of more menu type buttons on the top side of the controller. I could have gone with the full size arcade buttons, but that would mean cutting bigger holes and removing more plastic. You need to be conscious that when cutting away plastic from both the outside and inside, you are making the stick more fragile. There are some supporting pieces of plastic which basically hold this shell together and make up its foundation. So removing any of the plastic, and certainly removing more than you need to, is going to make it weaker. I also don't want to cut the holes too close together so that when I'm drilling into the stick it doesn't create cracks or splits or makes two small holes become one large hole or something like that. The cutting process actually takes 3 steps. The first one being the measuring I've already talked about, then the second one is cutting the pilot hole. The pilot hole is the first time you're going to be drilling into the stick, and this is where if you make a mistake there really isn't anything you can do to undo it. You've got to be aware that when you're cutting these holes, you're putting a lot of force onto the arcade stick. If you do it too quickly, you could press with the drill too hard and too fast and move the hole and create a scratch or a cut or a crack. But because of the force you're applying with the drill, it's inevitably going to move the arcade shell around. So you need to hold it in place. You could do this one of 2 ways. You could use a vice, which actually grips the shell and keeps it in position, or you could get a second person involved to hold the stick down and keep it in place, and that's what I did. I asked my wife, Lucy, to come and hold the stick whilst I pushed the drill into it. So there's an element of pressing down or clamping down on the stick shell to keep that shell still and not let it move a millimetre whilst you're cutting, and then you've got to press against that force to cut the hole. Thank you very much to my wife for helping with this. She was pressing down on the stick just enough to keep it still, but not too much to apply more pressure than was necessary. At first, it feels really intense and unpleasant and dangerous, and it is. You've got to maintain that focus and care from start to finish. But after doing the first one and seeing it go well, it did raise my confidence for the next one. Now, because there's more plastic inside that needs removing, you could choose to actually drill a hole and then drill a second hole through that hole. I chose not to do that. In some of the stories I've heard where the shell can crack, I think it's that fast turning friction which has caused it to pull on the plastic and create a crack. So I was happy just to drill through 3 times and then move on to a separate tool in order to remove the additional plastic on the inside of the shell. So once those 3 holes are cut on the outside, you've then got to contend with the plastic on the inside, and this is the final step of the mod. And because you're cutting on the inside of the stick where any damage you create is going to be hidden, really the stressful part of it is over. If you've cut those 3 external holes successfully and they're looking nice and they're the correct size, you're golden. You're on the home stretch now. So to cut the additional plastic away on the inside so that those buttons can fit in perfectly, I used a Dremel. A Dremel is a multi-purpose cutting tool, and I was actually given one for my birthday, especially for this mod. So using the circular fiberglass cutting disc, I was able to slice into the plastic and cut away some rectangular space so that those buttons could go through their circular holes all the way into the internal part of the stick. I was very careful again to measure out where to cut these holes so that I wouldn't be cutting away too much plastic, and most of all, you don't want to go a step too far and find that you've damaged the stick and then you just need to cut away a bit more to sort of clean up the mess you've made. The difficulty for me on one of these holes is that it actually crossed over a plastic support within the stick. So although I'd cut through the circular hole part, there was still a vertical piece of plastic inside, keeping that plastic area intact. I'd done the cutting correctly, and I knew that this was going to come up in the process, but I had to find a way to cut that plastic away. And there's really no step-by-step way I can phrase this, so it's just about looking at the situation, cutting away that internal plastic, and just going bit by bit by bit until you get rid of everything you need, and that hole is exposed and the button can go inside. So at this point we have extended cables, the buttons work on those cable extensions, we have then drilled holes into the stick, and we have dremeled away the additional plastic inside. Now comes pushing the buttons in, making sure they all look nice, testing that the buttons work, and if they do, close up that stick and you're done. And for me, this going well was such a relief that I wish I had done it sooner. I know that this is a very niche thing. Not everybody who's bought the Astro City stick wants to mod it, and certainly those who have modded it aren't necessarily going to be modding it to this extent. But now it's closed up and all the buttons work, it's all gone wonderfully, and the end result looks beautiful. I truly feel like this does look as though it was always like this, that it's not been modded. It looks as though I purchased the Astro City stick and those buttons are already there. So, thank you for watching this episode of Fossil Arcade. I hope you enjoyed seeing this mod take place, and maybe it's inspired you to do something like this of your own. I know it's been a long time since the last episode of Fossil Arcade, and that's not because we don't want to make the show anymore, it's just become a little bit harder to find the time. Things have been going on like weddings and babies and catching deadly viruses, but we still want to make videos, they're just going to be a bit fewer and far between. If you enjoyed this and you're not subscribed, give it a go, and we'll see you next time.